Love it. You guys so have the cue going on. Okay, so this next segment is simply about cognitive bias, okay? And there's several different reasons why we bring cognitive bias into this course, because historically this is not a concept around medicine or education. And over the last 32 years of managing risk at a professional level, ultimately what I started to understand about the decision-making process is that most people are not making decisions. Yeah. And what I mean by that is that we are often chasing desires, and sometimes those desires are compensatory, meaning that we're trying to prove ourselves to somebody. So we set out in order to do something to show others that we actually know what we're doing. So I can give you an example of a compensatory action. 35 years ago, my father told me that it was an extremely bad idea to go into the outdoor industry and that it was a failed state. There was no reason to go to school for it, and I was wasting my time. And so basically for the next 25 years that followed, I had a compensatory response that was based off of proving my father wrong. And even after I proved him wrong in the first 10 years, I never stopped making the same decisions, meaning I still had something to prove. The problem is that I proved it decades ago. And even because I did that based off of my past, I still kept repeating the past. And so we don't make decisions. This is kind of crazy. It's like, what's going on here? So it's like, how is it that you come up with the ideas in your head? Well, it's important to recognize that the ideas are based off of feelings that generate based off of experiences that you interact with. And so for instance, everybody in this room had an experience where they interacted with the outdoors, and based off of the feeling that it provided you, you said, you know what, I want to keep this feeling going. And so you make decisions in order to replicate the feeling. And sometimes you have goals and objectives within this medium, but you're incapable of meeting the goals and objectives because you're chasing a feeling instead of what you really want, okay? Now this gets tricky because basically what we're gonna do is I'm gonna try to help you understand how your brain works, how it's biased. We're all biased, okay? And what's important to recognize is that bias has been helping all of you survive, but bias often stops us from thriving, okay? It often stops us from thriving. And the majority of the ideas that you have in your head are not your own. They've been placed there by, well, first your family, then the people you surrounded yourself with, and then media. Media is probably today the number one reason why you think the things that you do, right? Like, for instance, it's interesting when I leave the country, which I do quite a bit now, and I go into Latin America, and they say to me, they're like, are you okay? They find out I'm from the United States, and they're like, are you okay? And I'm like, actually I am. And they're like, well, based off of what we hear, it seems like you folks are very sick. And I'm like, that's actually somewhat true from a collective consciousness. Now, let me back out of this. I'm gonna just kind of leave that there. So how did you come up with the ideas in your head? Well, the way you come up with that is that the first thing that occurs is that we have perceptions, okay? So how do we gain perception? So we gain perception through experience. And then through the experiences that we engage with, we then develop concepts. So what are concepts? Well, concepts are ideas, okay? Concepts are ideas. And then once we have ideas, so those ideas are also, could be called hypotheses, okay? We take these ideas and we test them, okay? We test these hypotheses. Now, and ultimately what we do with these hypotheses is we're looking for validation. Now, once we validate a hypothesis, we then create a belief structure, okay? So what is your belief structure? Well, your belief structure is your bias, okay? Belief structure is your bias. Bias is not good or bad, okay? It just kind of is. Now, once we create a belief structure, does anybody know what we do in order to reinforce our belief structure? Okay, we do keep doing the same thing that got us there, and then who do we place around us? Exactly. So we surround ourselves with like-minded thinkers. And if you didn't surround yourself with like-minded thinkers, one of two things would happen. You would either go crazy, because you would constantly be trying to validate your belief structure, or you would change your belief structure in order to be able to fit in with the individuals that you're with, okay? Now, here's the problem, okay? The experiences that you engaged with initially in this existence, in this life, weren't your choice, okay? You got born into a particular group of individuals that dictated your surroundings, okay? Now, what's even more fascinating is that you're actually not even intellectual for the first 8 years of your life, first 7 years of your life, 7, 8 years. And what I mean by that is that you don't think for yourself in the first 7 years of your life. Anybody who has ever worked with children, it's interesting because grade school teachers often make this statement where they're like, I like to work with second grade or younger, or third grade and older. Second grade and younger, they're impressionable. Third grade and older, they start thinking for themselves. And ultimately what happens is that biologically there is a change in you. There's a change in you. Now, the first 7 years in your life, your brain is in a theta state. It's a waveform, okay? Now, basically what's going on is that we have several different waveform states that our brain can go into, and the state that we're in dictates how we manage information, okay? And so, for instance, when you're in theta state, we'll just kind of focus on that one for this period of time. And so when you're in theta state, your brain mimics the state of hypnosis, okay? Mimics the state of hypnosis. And if anybody knows anything about hypnosis, is that you are open to suggestion when you are hypnotized. And so the other thing is that when you're hypnotized and you're open to suggestion, you drop judgment. And now this is a fascinating thing, which is that if you actually watch children in the first 7 years of their life, they're incredibly impressionable and they have very little opinion about anything. Why? Because they're just observers that are having information impressed upon them, okay? And then, when you start to think for yourself, well, the problem is that you're all the way down here. And who do you think like? The people you're surrounded with, your family, whether you like it or not, okay? And sometimes you start to develop judgment at that time as well. And so what's fascinating is that you may judge as you get older into your teens, you may judge that you do not like the belief structure that you were brought into. The problem is that your behaviors are attached to it and you don't know it. So this is why you can physically move people from an environment and put them into a new environment. And oftentimes their problems chase them with a delay. Meaning you move the environment and for a short period of time everything's better. But then what do? You start attracting the same like-minded ideas because of the behaviors that you exhibit, and you are not aware of the behaviors that you exhibit. Okay? That's how deeply impressed they are into your subconscious. And ultimately, these biases stop us from being able to take on new information. Okay? And so your past dictates the decision that you're going to make if you're using your brain, okay? Because your brain is hardwired to these initial experiences that you've occurred and the initial ideas that came from it. And then, unless you can kind of rise your consciousness above it, actually be aware of your behaviors, this is why it's so difficult to create change as you get older. It gets very, very difficult to change as you get older. So, precepts into concepts, concepts into hypotheses. We test these hypotheses, we turn them into belief structures, and then we surround ourselves with like-minded thinkers. And so, in simple form here, if you want to change your belief structure, well, if you already have ideas, well then great, you just need to test new ideas in a new environment with new people, and then you can come up with a new belief structure. Although, if you don't have any ideas, well, you need to gain new experiences so that you can come up with new ideas and then test them to come up with a new belief structure. Okay? And then ultimately surround ourselves with like-minded thinkers. Now, what's important to recognize is that if you're in alignment, if you're getting what you want out of life, okay, and it's all working, well, you're likely in alignment, okay? But if you're not getting what you want, you need to change something here, okay? And that's where this becomes very difficult, because ultimately you have to give up what you have in the present in order to be able to make room for something new to come on in. Now, the other thing that goes on with this is that depending on the experiences that you're having, so for instance, if your experience is generated through a screen, which a lot of people have that today. It's like, for instance, people often come up to me and they say, oh, you know, I think this thing or that thing. I'm like, where'd you come up with that? And they're like, oh, I found it from this source. And I go, awesome. Well, that source is biased. What do you mean? Well, it's the news. And I'm like, yeah, no kidding. The news is biased. Why? Because they're trying to sell something in order to make money so that they can pay their reporters. They're not worried about the truth. They're worried about trying to make money. And until you recognize that, it's kind of difficult. And there's definitely times where, like, people say to me all the time, they're like, you don't watch the news. Like, I haven't watched media in about 7 or 8 years. And they're like, how do you make decisions? And I go, because I'm not influenced by outside resources. And people say, well, you're not informed. And I go, well, absolutely I am. I'm informed by this thing. Because this thing is always correct. This thing, it's biased, okay? Because all of you know this, which is that there are things that you could do to improve your life, okay? But it's so difficult to do it that you lie to yourself that you're happy the way you are. Okay, and you don't make the change. We all do this. We all do this, okay? Now, the other thing is that when we're trying to get new information, we're biased from the past. So for instance, I joke about it, liability is an illusion. What's an illusion of? It's an illusion created by attorneys in order to make money, right? And if you buy into that illusion, well, then you have fear. And then what do you have fear of? Well, you have fear of being prosecuted against. And it's interesting because the more you fear something, the more likely it is to occur. Okay? The less you fear something, the less likely it occurs and the less impact it has on you if it does. Okay? These are all perceptions. These are all just perceptions. Like, for instance, risk is also an illusion, right? Because what's risky to me may not be risky to you, or may be extremely risky to you, but at the same time, who's right? No one. So I come back to the question stays the same, but the answer is always different, and it's individual, okay? I don't know if there is actually any factual truth. Why? Because I've watched factual truth change over and over and over and over again. All you have to do is look at the last 3 years. Okay? Because you probably don't believe the same things that you did 3 years ago. Okay? Right? But maybe you do. And so, for instance, I was teaching medicine during that time, and I was actually told I was completely wrong at a period of time. And I was like, that's interesting. I'm teaching research over here. And people would look at me and go, there's no way that could be right. And I'm like, well, let me dig back into it. And I go into the research and I'm like, but the research shows this. And they're like, no, you're wrong. This is what's being said. And I was like, oh, that's the bias that's out there. Okay. All right. So this is also important to recognize how powerful this is, because if you're in alignment, the greatest things occur in isolation with individuals that believe in the same outcome. Okay? Those are called think tanks. Okay? So for instance, like, who's got one? Can I steal this for a second? So this thing, okay? When I was born, they told me I'd have this in my pocket. You know what everybody said? Nah, that ain't gonna happen. How's that gonna happen, right? But there was a group of people who were actually taking psychedelics and we're thinking way outside of the box, and we're like, we can build this thing. And it was like, well, how? I don't know. But we believe it. And they believed it so much that they worked on it for so long that 15 years ago, they gave us a smartphone, and all of a sudden we were like, wow, this is crazy. This thing came out of nowhere. Literally, it came out of nowhere. It came out of raw materials that had no connection at all, but someone believed if you started to take these organic materials and move them like cobalt and lithium, and you use them in a certain way, all of a sudden you can create a supercomputer that can go in your pocket. 100 years ago, that was impossible, but today it's occurring. And that's the creative process that's so important to recognize, which is that we do the impossible every day. And we forget how powerful of creators we are because we've been told we don't have enough information. And the reality of it is that we don't need information, we need knowledge and we need wisdom, because data is what you find on Google. Knowledge is what you feel and understand and know. Not here, here, okay? So, you have this binary code that gets dropped into you when, for the first 7 years of your life, you're hypnotized by it. So for instance, let me give you a bias. My father was a bookie. You know what that is? Anybody know what a bookie is? Yeah. So you could bet with my father, okay? My father was really, really good at it, and actually everybody loved him because nobody ever owed him money, because if you owed him money, he was like, hey, you just don't bet with me. I got no problem with you. I still like you as a person. You can come into my bar. You can have a drink as long as you can pay for it. But if you owe me money, you're not going to bet with me. And everybody enjoyed him and thought he was a really good guy. My oldest brother was the number 2 guy in the largest organized crime operation from the 70s into the 80s. His bias was, you know what, Dad, you don't do this well enough. Let me show you how to do it. Yeah, right? And so what did he do? He believed that he could do it better, and then he surrounded himself with the mafia, and he did do it better until it didn't work out so well for him, okay? But the problem with that is that what it did is it created a bias in me in regards to how money operates and how relationships are created. And it kind of wrecked my life for the first part of my life, right? Because money, easy come, easy go. There's always another sucker that's gonna bet, so there's always money coming down the pipe. And then it only took me decades to figure out that it was a bad idea for me to gamble even though my father was good at it, okay? So those are biases, right? And it's incredibly difficult to change because you actually have to recognize that your approach to life is incorrect because you got the wrong message. My father taught me how to manage risk. He didn't teach me how to handle money. So once I realized that I could manage risk very well, which is what he was good at probability. And his probability was amazing around betting, but he bet it in an analytical process around odds, around teams and sports, etc. I just had to learn to take that lesson and remove it from money and put it into an outdoor environment where it was like, what's the probability of this slide occurring? What's the probability of me falling? What's the probability of weather moving in? Right? And then start to use the lessons in a different way. And basically what I had to do was like, if you grew up in my house, my father's friends, these are the people I was surrounded by when I was a kid. Yogi, Choo Choo, Shoes. Those were their names. I'm sure they had other names, but those were the names we knew. They were amazing human beings, but they did horrible things, right? And so once I realized that I needed to get out of the experience that my family was creating, I had the right ideas. I just had the wrong experiences that I was applying them to. And then I took those same ideas with the new experiences and was able to test them in a different environment and then come up with a belief structure that was very similar, although slightly parallel. And then I surrounded myself with different people in order to be able to get the outcomes that I was looking for. Because I can tell you that in high school and my first round of college, the people I surrounded myself looked like gangsters. Okay? And I normalized the environment, which I felt comfortable in, which was even stranger, which was we were risk tolerant. And that was the beauty of it, which is that that's what my family taught me, was how to be risk tolerant. I just had to change the environment in order to be tolerant in the right environment, okay? And to make it beneficial for me, okay? The idea is you have to incorporate yourself into this story somewhere in your own experience and then your own pitfalls through it, okay? Because I don't know what's going on with you. Although this framework holds up and validates over and over and again for all of us, okay? And the problem is that the bias that we initially set with is that deep-seated thing that's very difficult to change, and that's the piece you have to figure out. And so, for instance, if you've had previous experience with a medical training, like for instance, a couple of years ago, I remember having a student in here. He had taken a first aid CPR course before. That was the only training he had. We went into lifting and moving in this class, and he goes, well, they could have a spinal injury, so I'm not going to touch them. And I was like, but we have to provide care. And he was like, yeah, but I could hurt him. And I was like, but these methods are appropriate to move somebody with these injuries. And he was like, no way. So literally for the entire first day, he wouldn't touch anybody, and I had to walk up to him at the end of the day, and I said, what's going on? And he was like, I'm afraid of hurting people. I said, listen, your past is inhibiting you from doing something here in the future, which is upgrading your education. And he could not, it took him forever, and I literally had to give him an ultimatum, and I said, listen, you either start doing these moves and start interacting with individuals and put hands on, or you need to leave the class because you're not going to get any value out of this by observing. And then once he started to get into it, he was like, oh, you actually like have to move people. And like we were laughing, we were like, right, you actually have to move people. So we gave him a new experience, gave him new ideas. He tested it with a new group of people, surrounded by people that were already bought into it, and boom, immediately, he has a new belief structure. Okay? So that's bias. Okay? It's not good or bad. Okay, but just recognize that we all have it. Any questions? Any questions regarding that? Okay, now I'm gonna hijack you for a couple of more minutes here before we get into lunch. So